Good morning. Here we are today in the second lecture on Freud, and we are going to start right where we left off last time, and that is from dream theory, dream interpretation. For Freud, interpreting a dream means trying to trace the dream situation remembered and referred to by the dreamer, which is the manifest dream content. What does this mean? Freud actually divides the dream into two parts. One is the manifest dream content, and the other is latent dream content. What is the difference between these two parts? Manifest dream content is the part of the dream that we tend to remember. Does it ever happen to you when you're dreaming that, gee, I was dreaming about this thing, but that's all I remember. I only remember that image, or I only remember that dialogue, or I only remember that scene, and everything before that and everything after that, darn, I don't remember it anymore. Well, that small part of the dream that we remember, Freud identifies it precisely as manifest dream content, which is what we go to report to our therapist. Getting then to the complex of unconscious thoughts and feelings that generated that very dream, that very image, or that very scene that we remember, is the latent dream content. Latent, what does that mean? Hidden, meaning what is hidden behind what we dreamed, behind that specific image, behind that scene. Well, this is practically the work that Freud will then have to do, and that therapists will have to do precisely. In interpreting the dream, it is precisely the work of interpretation that reveals, according to Freud, always the fulfillment of a desire. That is, Freud says that when we dream something, even just that image, and we remember that scene we were talking about, behind it there is always the fulfillment of a desire. That is, there is a desire that we want in some way to fulfill, and it manifests itself through the dream. So, even if we have a nightmare, Freud says, it is always the deformed fulfillment of a desire that we have somehow repressed. The question may arise, but then if I dream of someone's death, does that mean I wish for that person's death? Well, no, actually that is not the case at all. Freud would say that behind precisely such a dream, we need to understand what is the desire that generated it. Often in dreams we tend to identify the other so for example, we dream about our mother, our father, or a loved one, but actually we are dreaming about a part of us, and with a projection mechanism we project and identify on the other figure a part of us. For example, I'll give a practical example so we understand each other. I'm experiencing a very anxious period. In my real life, my mother represents a very anxious person. So it is likely that in that particular period of my life, I have a dream starring my mother, where I precisely project, since in real life she represents anxiety, my momentary state. Not by chance, I go and dream about that very person. So, for example, dreaming about killing someone does not mean that we wish to kill that person, but maybe it means that there is a part of us that we project onto the other person, that we do not like, that we would like to change, or that is already changing. So let's say that dreaming precisely of someone's death does not mean wishing for their death, but it always reproposes a repressed impulse, Freud would say. Well, at this point we deal with the theory of sexuality. For Freud, the repressed material in our unconscious is predominantly sexual in nature. It has, shall we say, its roots in the infantile experience. What is sexuality? It is that original component of our psychic life, that is to say, at the origin of our mind, of our psychic life. There is precisely sexuality according to Freud, and it is, let us say, a drive toward the gratification precisely of our body. This drive is called the erotic drive, and libido is the psychic energy that is connected to it. So let's say that, according to Freud, most of the material that we remove in the unconscious is predominantly sexual in nature, because he says that equal to the mental development of the child, there is also a sexual development, so much so that he calls it as psychosexual development of the child divided into various stages. Now let's try to understand a little bit what that means. Freud says that from 0 to 18 months you go through the first phase. We all go through it, which is the oral phase, where practically the pleasure, since it is related precisely to the, let's say, sexual aspect, the pleasure is concentrated in the pursuit of oral activities. The child, in fact, has that perinstinct of survival, attaches to the mother's breast, and therefore does not only satisfy the need for survival, but according to Freud, the pleasure is precisely concentrated in the sucking, and therefore satisfies this pleasure as well. After this phase is over, we move on to the anal phase, which is around 18 months until about 3 or 4 years old. It is obvious that then the ages are relative because each child has its own times. So around 18 months, the child shifts his pleasure from the mouth to the anus, in that he takes pleasure in the act of evacuating, and once he has evacuated, he is somewhat attracted to his own excrement. What does this mean? A child who goes from diaper to producing his own feces is still a proud child. Let's think, if we put ourselves in a child's head, it is a great achievement to be able to do something independently for the first time, and if the child is left alone, he will probably begin to play with his own feces to somehow experience what he has produced himself. Once you get past the anal phase, you move into the phallic phase from age 3 to 4 onwards, and the interest is in both male and female male genitalia, as children realize that they have a protuberance that females don't have, and females realize that males have it and they don't. So there is the classic penis envy that little girls feel, and that boys, on the other hand, brag about having because they have this extra thing. Once this phase has passed, there is a stasis phase which Freud identifies as the Oedipal phase, that is the one dominated by the Oedipal complex, which is called a phase of latency or sexual asleep. That is, Freud says that in this phase there are no sexual instincts, and let's say it is called the Oedipal phase, precisely because from the Oedipus legend that basically sees the male platonically in love with the mother and the female. Electra complex is called for little girls in love with the father. What does this mean? That, as the legend tells us, the child tends to want all the mother's attention for himself alone, and anyone who stands in the way, the older brother, the father, etc., become an obstacle to the realization of this desire of his, and therefore a kind of jealousy is formed. Same thing as far as the girls are concerned towards the father. Having passed this stage, then one enters puberty, pre-adolescence, and then there are all the other stages of development. The last topic I want to cover today, to do this quick introductory excursus on Freud, is the analysis of the human psyche, because Freud divides our psyche ideally into 3 different levels: the ES, the ego, and the superego. So Freud says that precisely our mind is divided into these 3 components. The S is the instinctual component. It is that component through which we always try to satisfy our needs, our libido. So whatever we think of doing, we do. And according to Freud, precisely, the child is born all as the child is born, I want that, without realizing that others exist and without realizing the limits that there may be. Then there is the superego, which on the other hand is that unconscious psychic structure deputed to the moral control of our actions, and so it is the part that is very rigid. It is the one that tells us, this thing you must not do, this thing neither. So it is the strong sense of duty, the one that is a little bit exaggerated, that is formed, according to Freud, after the Oedipal phase is overcome. So let's say we are born S for Freud, and after the overcoming of the famous Oedipal phase I mentioned earlier, the superego is also formed. In these 2 instances, the ES and the superego are at the 2 opposites. One is the unrestrained realization of one's desires, and the other is the super rigid part. In the middle is the ego. The ego is that sort of mechanism that functions a bit as a balancer between the 2 opposites, and thus tries to mediate what are the unbridled demands and needs of the ES and, let's say, the overly rigid part of the superego. So Freud says precisely that if you have a balance, a good balance, it is because there is an ego that functions very well, that is therefore able to keep in balance, I repeat, the two opposing parts between them. Well, with that for today, we have finished our discussion on Freud. I invite you to go deeper and ask me questions on the topic if you have any curiosities. And above all, I invite you to follow on Netflix a series devoted precisely to Freud and precisely to the early years on Freud. I don't want to give spoilers, but I will tell you that it's about the first part of Freud's career, so a very young Freud, a Freud who will put his psychiatric knowledge of the time to use in solving cases, so it also has some thriller veins, but it's definitely interesting because it tries to analyze the human soul, the human mind, through the knowledge of the time. So I invite you all to see it, because then maybe we will talk about it again. Greetings to everyone, and thank you.